training. So it's just been, well, I just created it, so we'll see how it goes. And there's also going to be, the slides are going to be sent out afterwards by email, as well as our feedback form if you want to kind of give any feedback, anything like that. So very big welcome and thank you for coming along. And I want to start by saying that, like, if you're here tonight, even if you don't think you are a leader at Animal Rebellion, and that's really exciting. Like, just being here, kind of coming along to trainings, like, anyone can be a leader at Animal Rebellion, and we all have that capacity within us. And I think it's really fantastic to see so many people from so many different parts of the world kind of stepping up and taking on this idea of, you know, what Animal Rebellion is. And yeah, I want to start with this quote, which is regrettably by Henry Ford, who I'm not the biggest fan of, but I think it is a good quote, which is that coming together is a beginning, keeping together is progress, and working together is success. And when we think about forming groups and starting to try and, you know, tackle an issue as a group, it can, I think this is really rings true to me. So just quickly, I'll say what we'll cover, which is kind of a little bit of an overview about Animal Rebellion and our strategy, and then forming a group, starting out, and a bit on goal setting. And then we'll kind of move into a chance to share and discuss and ask questions. So I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about who we are as Animal Rebellion. And this will probably be familiar to most of you, but I think it's always good for a bit of a refresher. And also, like, I always include it in what I'm doing to remember that, you know, this isn't just kind of something that we see in DNA strategy or kind of see when we're talking about the strategy of Animal Rebellion. It's something that kind of it's part of everything that we do. So part of who we are, a big part of who we are, is our strategy. And as much as that, it's how we think about strategy. And the way we think about strategy is in this way that we have this big goal, which is at the very top of kind of what we're trying to do, which is, you know, a plant-based food system. But we don't just have that goal and kind of go off in different directions trying to get there, kind of frantically being like, oh, it's too much, and then, you know, crumble and fall. We break it down into different elements. So we break it down into our milestones, which are points along the way. And they're points that when we get there, we know we're making progress towards our goal. And then from our milestone, we break it down further into what are our campaigns, what are very specific objectives that we can work towards that are moving us towards our milestones and then our objective. And then from that, we break it down into tactics. And these are, you know, actions. These are things that we do which make up our campaigns. So for example, at the moment, we have the Plant-Based Councils campaign going on in the UK. And, you know, that's really kind of going at a milestone of we want to see political change. We want to see change in how politics is kind of addressing and including our issue. So it has a very specific objective and a very specific focus. And there's other ways that we can go about things as well, which are going in different directions. So just a refresher, we all know that, you know, as Animal Rebellion, our strategic objective is a just, sustainable plant-based food system in the UK, but also I think in different parts of the world as well, even if, you know, the language used might be different in different contexts. For example, I know in Canada, like, this is something that they, like, Animal Rebellion Canada has to work within like the framework of Indigenous rights as well, and how, you know, maybe just and sustainable plant-based food system isn't the right way of framing what they want, but they can kind of collectively work together to kind of work towards that same kind of objective. So this is our strategic objective. It's basically the point that when we get there, we're put ourselves out of a job. And the aim of, I think, everything we do is to make ourselves unnecessary. And this applies to us as an organization, and it also applies to us as leaders. So when we're thinking about forming groups and building teams, always as a leader, like, the goal is to kind of make yourself unnecessary. You're upskilling and empowering other people. And kind of, I guess, the ultimate end goal is that you have nothing to do because so many people are coming up, but then there's always more things to do, of course. So this is just a bit of a snapshot of some of the milestones that have been identified already for Animal Rebellion. And this is always growing and always evolving. But some of the ones that have come up and that we've kind of been working towards for the last year and a bit is to raise public awareness, so change the way the public talk about plant-based food systems. So essentially shift like the Overton window, which means like, yeah, shift what is acceptable in society. So for, you know, at the moment and historically, it's been accepted, like the only thing that's been acceptable is that, you know, animal products are an essential part of the food system for a number of reasons. And what we're trying to do is trying to shift that to show not only that there are like alternatives, but that those alternatives are actually necessary and needed in order to kind of change this kind of path we're moving forward. Another one is to become a critical part of the climate movement. So for a long time, we saw the climate movement essentially not addressing the issue of animal agriculture. And we wanted to kind of, when we started this animal rebellion, we wanted to see that change. We wanted to see animal agriculture being talked about and being addressed as just as big an issue as, you know, other things like the fossil fuel industry, the oil and gas industry. And another one is to change what's happening in politics, to changing things like MP voting habits, having governments making statements. And this also includes things like, you know, when we think about subsidies, changes in subsidies, and bills and laws that might come into play later on in the game. And, you know, we do want to see the climate movement be successful in its aims. And when we talk about the climate movement, you know, a lot of the time we are talking about XR because of our close affiliation with them. So, you know, they will have this aim of a citizens' assembly, and we want to see them be successful in that. But we also kind of want to be working in our own way to kind of get the issue that we're particularly focusing on into a different sphere, and the sphere that we want it to be in. So as well as our strategy, we have how we fit together. And something that I think is really important to mention here is that our strategy is like fractal in a big way, which means that it's like infinitely repeating. So we have our strategy on like a global level, which is, yeah, our big strategic objective, our milestones and our campaign. But you'll also have a strategy in your team. And there'll be, you know, strategies at a local level, and then on the team level, and a national level as well. And they'll all probably like follow a similar trajectory to this, where you have your big objective as a team, and then you have your ways of getting there, your milestones and your campaigns and kind of actions and tactics. So it's a really fractal kind of way of looking at strategy. So, you know, you can use this same triangle or pyramid structure in your team to design strategy as it's used kind of at different levels throughout your whole organization. And with that, like our structure as well is really similar in that we have the same structure on all levels of the organization. So if you've been involved with animal rebellion for a little bit, you'll probably be familiar with kind of the concept of like circles and super circles. So essentially we have these things called circles, which are a collection, is like a team with a specific function. And then a super circle is a collection of teams or with a shared function. So for example, you know, media and messaging in animal rebellion is a super circle. And within that, there's editorial, there's press, there's social media. And then within social media, for example, there's Facebook, Instagram. So it's kind of this like it goes inwards and inwards and inwards, but it's the same structure on all the different levels. And a way of kind of like a reason for this is that we want to have information flowing in all directions. And rather than having like, you know, a top source of information like you have in a traditional hierarchical structure where you have, you know, your CEO or your corporate elites kind of at the top of, you know, on the top floor of the building, and information only flows down and occasionally kind of trickles up. We want to see information flowing freely in all directions. And the one way of doing this is to have like specific people or roles that fulfill the kind of purpose of communicating within circles. So if you see these dots here, they kind of represent, we usually call them like the internal and external coordinator, whereas like the internal coordinator like coordinates the internal structure of the team. The external coordinator's role is to represent that team at the next level. So if we have like, if we look at this green circle, for example, and pretend this is like, you know, media and messaging, we might have like this, one of these smaller circles might be social media, and they have a representative that kind of represents social media in the media and messaging circle. And then there'll be a representative from the media and messaging circle who represents them in the kind of, sorry, I just need to let the dog out of my room. There we go. At like, so yeah, and then there'll be a representative who represents them at the next level, which will be, you know, which we call anchor, which is kind of a space for communication flow to happen. So within those groups, the groups have the autonomy to fulfill their mandate, so to fulfill their purpose and what they're trying to do. And the unity comes through our culture and through our message. So I think what's really important is to that idea of communication flowing in all directions, and also this idea of like a structure that repeats on all levels. So we have the same kind of flow of communication. We have the same election process, all levels of organization. And the aim within that is to kind of remove this idea that there's someone who has control over the organization, and instead disperse and decentralize the control of what's going to happen, while also having this flow of communication which allows for unity and collectivity. And we'll talk a little bit more about kind of how to get that unity while being decentralized a little bit later on. So as well as, you know, what brings us together and how we fit together, we have what keeps us together. And this is really where culture comes in. So these are our principles and values. I'm not going to go through them here. I think, you know, hopefully everyone's a little bit familiar with them, or has, you know, at least seen them before. And if not, you know, they're on our website. But I think there's something within this, which is that culture isn't just, you know, being nice to each other and making sure we're getting enough rest and well-being, and, you know, the idea of regenerative culture and making sure people aren't burning out. Like, that's a big part of it. But a even bigger part of it is when we talk about our culture, we're talking about trying to vision the world that we're trying to build. So as Animal Rebellion, we're an organization that's, you know, building for a different future, for a change. And our culture is part of that visioning exercise. And of course, as well as what keeps us together, and I'd be remiss not to mention it, is our message. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later when we get into forming a group. But this is a frame actually that we developed during the recent messaging workshops with a whole bunch of people from Animal Rebellion, from all over the world, and this idea of our unique role as Animal Rebellion. But yeah, I'll talk a little bit more about our message and staying on message later on. So moving into forming a group now. So this will be quite short because I think most people here are in the lucky position of having, you know, at least a small collection of people. But I wanted to kind of give the foundations of, you know, getting together and what it looks like and what it might be like to kind of form a new group, and some challenges as well. So first off, I wanted to point out that, you know, a group starts with one person, and there's a fantastic video. I love it. It's probably my favorite video in leadership, which is called, I'll post it in the chat in a minute when I turn off my camera, but it's called like lessons on leadership from Dancing Man. Actually, I'm going to share it. It's a fantastic video. Has anyone seen it? Give me a wave. Okay, I'm going to share it then. I think it's a great video, and I think it's a perfect lesson on being a party of one. Dancing. Here we go. Okay, yeah. Can people
If you've
hear?
learned a lot about leadership and making a movement, then let's watch a movement happen start to finish in under 3 minutes and dissect some lessons. First, of course, a leader needs the guts to stand alone and look ridiculous. But what he's doing is so simple, it's almost instructive. This is key. You must be easy to follow. Now here comes the first follower with a crucial role. He publicly shows everyone else how to follow. Notice how the leader embraces him as an equal. So it's not about the leader anymore. It's about them, plural. Notice how he's calling to his friends to join in. See, it takes guts to be a first follower. You stand out and you brave ridicule yourself. Being a first follower is an underappreciated form of leadership. The first follower transforms a lone nut into a leader. If the leader is the flint, the first follower is the spark that really makes the fire. Now here's the second follower. This is a turning point. It's proof the first has done well. Now it's not a lone nut and it's not two nuts. 3 is a crowd and a crowd is news. A movement must be public. Make sure outsiders see more than just the leader. Everyone needs to see the followers because new followers emulate followers, not the leader. Now here come 2 more people, then 3 more immediately. Now we've got momentum. This is the tipping point, and now we have a movement. As more people jump in, it's no longer risky. If they were on the fence before, there's no reason not to join in now. They won't stand out, they won't be ridiculed, and they will be part of the in crowd if they hurry. And over the next minute, you'll see the rest who prefer to stay part of the crowd, because eventually they'd be ridiculed for not joining. And ladies and gentlemen, that is how a movement is made. So let's recap what we've learned. If you are a version of the shirtless dancing guy, all alone, remember the importance of nurturing your first few followers as equals, making everything clearly about the movement, not you. Be public, be easy to follow. But the biggest lesson here, did you catch it? Leadership is over-glorified. Yes, it started with the shirtless guy, and he'll get all the credit, but you saw what really happened. It was the first follower that transformed a lone nut into a leader. There's no movement without the first follower. See, we're told that we all need to be leaders, but that would be really ineffective. The best way to make a movement, if you really care, is to courageously follow and show others how to follow. When you find a lone nut doing something great, have the guts to be the first person to stand up and join in.
Let's see if I can just make that stop. Yeah, so I really love that video for a number of reasons, but I think it is a really great study on, leadership and what it takes. And I think when we think about, forming a new group, it can be intimidating. And even when we think about, having quite a small group, it can feel like, oh, we're not doing, a good enough job. We need to keep growing. And that's true. Like, growth mobilization is fantastic. But I think sometimes we underestimate I keep adding a new slide instead of, there we go. We underestimate the ability for a small group or even one person to bring people in. I think there's some really key things in there about, being public and embracing, those first people, because new people who come in will, emulate followers, not necessarily like that first person who started things. And there's also, I wanted to mention as well, is like some ideas about mobilizing. And I think there's a lot of things that we can do which don't take many resources and are quite, small. The simple things like inviting a friend, inviting everyone who comes to, bring a friend along to a meeting, reaching out to similar groups, posting in local XR groups. Things like uni vegan societies are a great example, or like uni societies for anything. Calls out on social media as well, like personal social media, any pages that you're part of. And I wanted to kind of as well, as I mentioned, like at the end, I think this is one topic to return to as well, like how groups have had success mobilizing people in their kind of context as well. But before, I also wanted to say that there has been a mobilization training that was just run this weekend just been, And that goes into a lot more depth about this kind of topic. And I'll share the link to that in the email as well. But I just wanted to give a kind of a quick overview of some ideas about bringing in new people and starting that snowball. So different groups within Animal Rebellion. So as an organization, we have a lot of different ways to kind of start things and get involved. And I guess like the biggest mass of that is like a country group or a national team. These are things like Animal Rebellion UK, Animal Rebellion Ireland as well. So this is like if you're in a country and there's nothing at the moment, like that is one option to kind of start that. But a lot of the time, we're in the position where that's already been started. And there's a lot of other kind of groups as well. And there's also, there might be people kind of stepping up who want to start something for their own. And, we don't want to have 4 Animal Rebellion Islands popping up, for example. But we do want to kind of build on what we're doing. So there's regional hubs. And this is kind of a little bit newer as an idea within Animal Rebellion. It's been in XR for a bit longer, but this is the idea that it's a bit bigger than a local group, but smaller than a national group. So this might be a city hub. So for example, like Animal Rebellion London, which might contain 4 or 5 local groups. So it's a little bit bigger on scale, but it kind of nested within that is our local groups, and that's on a local level, it might be your local town, it might be kind of a region of a city. So in London, we have Animal Rebellion Hackney, for example, and it might even, kind of grow to be quite a small kind of collection, because as we'll talk about a little bit later, is this idea that a really great way of forming and growing as a team is to not let yourself get too big. It's to grow to a certain point and then split off into different groups, and there may be different groups focusing on different things. So for example, we have, teams or circles. So you might start off with a local group where you're all meeting together and you're kind of coming up with ideas together and everything's done by a certain amount of people. But then when you get to a certain point, and usually like the optimum team size is usually kind of considered to be 6 to 8 people, because teams they're not just formed as a team. What really makes a team is the relationship, the individual relationships between each person in that team. And when you get past like 6, 7, 8, those individual relationships become more than kind of an individual person can very well manage. So it's like when you get to that point, it's like, okay, how can we start to split off? So it might be to form another local group, or it might be, to split off into circles. So one little group focusing on actions, or one group focusing on media and things like that. We also have community groups and affinity groups. And these are really important. Community groups are based on identities. So this might be something like Animal Rebellion Teachers has just been formed, for example, or it might be different faith groups, or kind of different groups of people who share a common identity. And these might be people who decide to do actions together, or it might be more of a community space. And then we have affinity groups, and these are action groups. And these might pop up separate, like you might have affinity groups popping up who are acting in the name of Animal Rebellion, who might not even be part of a local group. But if they are popping up, it's a really good way of finding people who are really engaged and who are kind of keen to get more involved. And then of course, like there's these little gray dots dark gray dots that I've put in everything. These are our working groups. So I'm sure most of you here know or have been part of a working group or know what a working group is. And essentially this is like when you're in your groups, it's finding new projects and taking action on them. And rather than trying to do it as kind of like a whole, it's like people separating off and working on individual projects together. So you might have a working group. If you're planning an action, for example, you might have a working group working on the arts. You might have a working group, working on the press for it. So working groups are really really great, and they're a really good way of making sure movement is happening in a group. Because sometimes, you'll, just say you meet once a week as a whole group, you kind of get to the point where there's so much stuff to discuss in those meetings that you don't feel like you're able to get anywhere. Whereas if you have working groups going off and doing things and then reporting back, a lot more progress can be made, and people can start to step up, because someone who might be a bit quieter in a whole big group might really be able to shine in a working group where there's fewer people, and they can kind of start to step up and take on something that they feel really passionate about or that matches their skills. So starting out, I think for me, the really primary thing that I want to stress when thinking about like starting out as a group or the early days is this having a sense of shared purpose. And I think, sometimes we'll jump into a group and we just want to start by doing stuff, and that's fantastic. And we want to be taking action. But sometimes if we do that and we jump in and we're just like, yes, let's do stuff, a little bit down the line, the group might start to fracture a bit. And what often is the cause of that is this lack of having a shared purpose, this lack of understanding as a group, what are we striving towards? What is our role within the kind of broader structure? So this is just that, it allows us to define who you are, what you're doing, and making sure that everyone is on the same page. So I really encourage like having that sit down quite early and sussing out what do we want to achieve as a team, and setting those goals for like 6 months, 3 months, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, and also thinking about your mandate. So a mandate is like an SOS term, which is self-organizing system, which is what we use. We use holacracy at Animal Rebellion. And sometimes it can be a bit like, oh my gosh, there's so much jargon. There's so many things I have to know. But really, kind of bottom line, you don't have to be an expert in holacracy to think about purpose. And I think for me, the easiest way to think about it is it's to, by, and in order to. And this is a great way of structuring the purpose of your group, also the purpose of projects and things that you're working on. And essentially it's, what are you doing? So like our group is doing this to, like, make it like, and then you put like, what is your goal? And then by, and that's how are you doing it? And then in order to is your connection to the bigger picture. So I'll try and give a really simple example. So the purpose of, I'm going to go back to say like social media, for example, and this is going to be a very shoddy example, so I apologize, but you might say, the purpose of social media is to create dynamic and engaging content by, making graphics, writing posts, and sharing, having a social media strategy in order to allow Animal Rebellion to reach the public and shift public consciousness about plant-based food system. So it's your what, your two is kind of your, what are you trying to do? How are you going to do it? And what is the bigger picture connection? And I think it's a really, really helpful thing to just make sure everyone feels that sense of collective purpose and mission. And I feel like it's also something that's great to return to when, there's questions that come up and conflicts and we're not sure what we're doing and how do we know if this is the right thing to do? Because if you have that shared purpose early on, then that's something you can always return to and go, okay, this is what we're trying to do. This is who we are. This is how we connect to the bigger picture. So this, this is why we should do this, or this is why maybe that's not the best idea. And kind of on top of that is really kind of getting a sense of what matters to your group. So, things like group agreements, meeting structures, and shared values. So, we have our Animal Rebellion principles and values, and there might be some that particularly are particularly important to your group. and you might, pick one and be like, this is our group value. This is what, no matter what we are using as our kind of guiding light, I guess. And I think like having meetings like that early on, or, later on, if it's something that didn't happen or, needs refresh, I think it always needs refreshing. I think they're a good way of bringing people together, and it's also a good way of identifying tensions and fault lines and places where there isn't cohesion. So this is a tree, as you can see. This is something I've started using to think about this idea of like our purpose, our mission, our mandate. Because if you've seen like, introductory packs, you might have like introductions to SOS, which explains what a mandate is and all that. But I think, sometimes it can be a bit theoretical, can be a bit kind of esoteric. So I like this idea of a tree, which is that the top of the tree is your purpose, your objective. And it's at the top of the tree because you're always growing towards it. If you've reached it, then that's fantastic, but you never really reach it because it's always kind of moving a little bit further away, but you're always growing towards it. And then you have your branches, and those are the things that are moving towards your purpose and objectives. So these are your accountabilities, your tactics, and your projects. These are what are kind of moving upwards towards this objective. And if they start kind of growing off sideways and are going off in some other direction, then that's when you'll be like, okay, we need to prune a little bit and move everything back in so we're all moving in the same direction. You see this tree is not doing a great job. I could do better. And then you have the roots of your tree. These are the things you don't often see, but you know how important they are to the kind of life of your group. And these are structure, communication. These are the things that often go unsaid. And I think a really important thing to point out about structure is that a lot of the time when we think about decentralization, a question comes up, which is like, well, if we're decentralized, why do we have such a kind of strict structure? And the answer really, like when we think about our system, is that if you don't have a structure in place, one will emerge, and about 90% of the time, it will be a structure that replicates the dominant structure. And at the moment, that's a hierarchical structure. That's a very, toxic patriarchal structure. So if we don't kind of have that structure that's clear and defined, then informal structures will emerge, which will often be things that we're trying to avoid. And that's the same with communication, having things like processes for feedback, processes for conflict, I think is a really fantastic tool. So, as I said, this is returning to that idea of the message. And this is something I really can't stress enough. Our messaging is like our lifeblood as an organization. It's our strength, and I'm not just saying this because I'm on the messaging team, but it really is. It's what makes us unique and recognizable, and it's what holds our vision and DNA, which is what allows us to mobilize. So our message and being unified in our message is what makes us Animal Rebellion, rather than just a collection of different groups all trying to do the best thing. But our strength comes from being Animal Rebellion, from being united, from being kind of a collective entity rather than a bunch of separate things. And the way I think one of the best ways, or the most kind of clear ways that I kind of think about it, is that we think of like a chain restaurant or a chain store at all, which aren't very good. But if you think about it, people eat at chain restaurants because they're familiar, because they know what to expect. And if you went to like, a McDonald's, for example, in America, and then you went to one on the other side of the world, you'd know what you're getting and you trust it. People trust it. And our message kind of operates in a similar way. It's what makes us recognizable and trustworthy, because people know what they're going to get. So, for example, Animal Rebellion is nonviolent. That's such a core part of our message, and it's a core part of the way we communicate in our tone. Another thing is that we listen to the science. So people know, if we make our messaging clear, that everything we say is backed by science. But if, for example, a group was to kind of be like, oh, I don't like that part of the message, or it's not really kind of what I want to do. And they kind of go off and do a different thing and change the way they message. And people are going to kind of lose that trust in Animal Rebellion. And we're not going to seem like this unified force moving towards a different future. We're going to seem like a kind of collection of random groups all kind of doing their own thing. And I think, like, you know, one thing that is talked about in the story DNA, and I think is really important, is this difference between our individual and our shared message. So we all have individual messages. You know, they come from our stories, they come from our history, and they're really important. They're fantastic, and they're what we use to communicate about the world. And, you know, things like recruitment, individual messages are so powerful when we share why we're taking action. But we also have our shared message as Animal Rebellion, and that's what makes us strong as an organization. And in some instances, our individual messages and our shared messages might not match up completely. So our kind of personal life and our personal experiences and what we believe is the best way to say things might not match up with what Animal Rebellion is kind of putting out, what Animal Rebellion believes is the best way of doing things in our context. And that can be hard for people to kind of be like, but aren't I kind of, you know, sacrificing or compromising on my values by saying this message? A great example is, you know, when Animal Rebellion talks about system change rather than individual change. And we have a lot of people who will do a lot of advocacy based on individual change, and that's fantastic. And we want that to be happening. But when that comes into Animal Rebellion, that means that our messaging is weakened because it's not consistent. It's not that kind of strong, unified message. So I think when we recognize that we have our individual and unique stories, and that's fantastic, and it's that whole idea of an ecology, that Animal Rebellion is fulfilling one part, and there's a lot of other groups fulfilling other parts. So messaging is, as I said, so important, but it can also be one of the trickiest things when we come to forming new teams and getting them operated, because people come in, as I said, with their own stories and they want to share those stories. And it can be hard sometimes to balance that sharing people's stories and having a unified message. So I have a couple of tips here about ways of embedding messaging into a team. I think the top one is running DNA, and this can be tricky to get people going. And I think, you know, when we get people coming to our meetings, so for example, like, you know, Animal Rebellion UK has a talks and trainings team, and an integration team who hold the kind of DNA trainings, and there's always trainers who are happy to come along to meetings and run those trainings in person rather than kind of relying on people going along to a training that's already being run. So it's like scheduling something that works for the people in your team rather than people having to walk around the schedule that's already existing. There's also being able to get people trained, and this is another thing that at the moment the UK can offer, and eventually like groups all around the world will be able to offer this as well, because as soon as you're trained as a trainer, then you can start to train other people to deliver the DNA. So that's another thing as well. I think also shadowing roles and rotating frequently, because when we start out, like, we don't know what we're doing. I still don't know what I'm doing half the time, and I've been involved with Animal Rebellion for over a year now. And I think one of the biggest things I know that helped me when I first joined Animal Rebellion was being able to shadow someone when they were doing something, when they were doing a role, and see how they did it, and someone who's a bit more experienced than me or have been doing something for a while. And then it's also the idea of like rotating. So eventually, if someone's, you know, been with a group for a long time, they might just strike on the thing that, yeah, this is my thing. I'm really good at this. I love this. But at the start, you know, we don't know until we try. And sometimes it can be a great thing to, you know, someone might be doing on social media, but it might be that for that role, you have it like on a monthly thing, and every month people rotate in and out. So it can be people are getting a sense of it, and people are seeing what other people do and learning from each other. I think also creating spaces for discussion and asking questions. So there's a great book called Swarmwise, which talks about grassroots organizing. And one of the key things that comes up in that book over and over again is that for grassroots teams, like having social space is one of the most one of the key indicators of like a team, like sticking together and being unified. That's really hard right now with COVID, of course. But I think like discussion spaces that are less formal, less, have less like agendered, with, we have to get through all these points, spaces where people can ask questions and share what's going on for them. Because a lot of the time, people want to be heard. And if there's a tension, sometimes like quite a lot of the time, just hearing that tension can go a long way to kind of solving it. And I think when messaging kind of comes up, that's a big one. I've already talked about personal and shared story. And I think another thing is like stepping up people who are understanding. So if there's someone who's really clicking in, who's going to the DNAs, who's really kind of keen to be involved, like giving them more, asking if they want to take on more, empowering them, and peer-to-peer mentoring is a great way of doing that. So again, like buddying people up with someone who's been involved for a little bit, or it might not even be with Animal Rebellion, it might just be with doing advocacy and activism in general, buddying people up so people are sharing, skill sharing. And then I think differentiating between outward facing and inward facing roles. So if there's someone who doesn't feel confident about like the DNA, about things like message, they might be a great person to like shadow on an outward facing role like social media, rather than kind of taking it on straight off the bat, and having people who are confident and understand the importance of messaging like in those outward facing roles, and then rotating. So I also wanted to share some resources for visual messaging, which is also really important. So we have our chat, which is the graphics chat on Mattermost, and that's a place where you can post requests for graphics to the graphics team. This can be posters, it can be social media graphics, anything that you can think of. And we also have the graphics guidelines, which have our color scheme, our logos, our fonts, and all of that. So if you don't already have that, there's some links there, which will be in the follow-up email. So this is, I think, one of the big things, this idea of balancing unity and autonomy. And I think the biggest thing that comes up for me is that decentralization doesn't mean that we don't have alignment, but unity and alignment allow for decentralization, because they give us the speed and flexibility of the individual and the power and the wisdom of the group. And our key areas for unity are in our visuals and our messaging and our goals, which they're developed by our narrative and they influence our messaging. And this isn't trying to dictate what groups should do. It's merely just giving the information from the wisdom of the group, and then we can use that in our own team to adapt and evolve. So moving on to the next little bit, which is planning for action. So this is kind of going into this idea of what can we do to start planning and acting. And here's some suggestions. And in the next little bit, the last section, I'm going to go through some ideas about setting goals. But I think when we're kind of in that phase, we've formed as a group, we know our purpose, we feel confident in the message, we feel confident in who we are, what we're trying to do. That's when we can start to, set goals, running a strategy session to do things like find our 6 months and one month goal even. I think, it's good to get started small and just start with small actions that will then build up. I think this is a great chance as well to say that, we talk a lot about unity, and unity is so important, but also like people are all around the world. Like there's stuff happening, there's local context. And I think, Animal Rebellion Island, who fantastic are here, a great example of this with like farms, not factories. And that was like identifying something that was kind of part of your local context and something that's kind of relevant, and identifying this and building on that and using our messaging to build on that. I think training and learning together is fantastic. So running DNA sessions in your meetings, getting people trained up to run those sessions, discussion spaces, personalized trainings, and skill sharing is also great. So if there's a training that doesn't exist that you think would be really useful, there's teams in UK at the moment, which eventually will be all around the world, which can make those trainings and deliver those trainings. They might also be things that you can make as a team, where someone can go away who has particular skills in an area, and develop a little presentation or a skill sharing. And I think that's a really fantastic way to grow as a team. So final session, and we should have plenty of time for discussion, which is fantastic, which is setting goals. So every time we set a goal, and this is at every level, this isn't just like a local group should always be referring back to this, or international groups should always be referring back to this. This is at every level of animal rebellion. There's a lot of different shades of pink on this slide. Didn't realize that, sorry. Everyone, whenever we set goals, we're referring back to our strategy, our grand strategy triangle, as this is called. So we're thinking, is this in service of our strategic objective? Is this something that is moving us towards that? Or is it kind of going off? We're also thinking, is this in line with our theory of change? So our theory of change is about, this idea of like mass nonviolent action. And sometimes we have to be flexible with that. For example, during a national pandemic where we can't do mass actions very easily. But it's also this idea that as an organization, we're playing kind of like the outside game. We're playing that game of mobilizing the public rather than, maybe the inside game, which is more like lobbying or running for office, things like that. So we can think about that as well. Like, is this in line with our theory of change? And also thinking about, is this something that we feel is moving us towards one of our milestones? Or is there another milestone that hasn't been identified yet that we think is really connected to this objective? There's also that a lot of stuff is happening in an animal rebellion at all times. And, we just know as humans that when we pull together, we get so much more done. So if there's stuff that's already happening within a group in your area or a group just in animal rebellion in general, like that's a great opportunity to jump on board and to kind of put momentum behind something. And I think a great example of that is like the Blood on the Hands action last year. And that happened all over the world. And it showed, it really put us on the map as this is a unified movement. This isn't just, this isn't just the UK, and it isn't just a bunch of kind of random groups. Like, this is a unified movement. So finding those areas of commonality where we can really pull together, I think that's fantastic. And that's really like where we should be moving when we're setting goals. And I want to stress here that, you can't do everything, as much as like we can't do everything as much as we wish we could. And, there's always more that we can do. There's always another campaign that should be running. There's always another area. There's always another action. And we can always think of more and more things to do. And I think like the biggest tip and recommendation I'll give is to just pick one area of the pyramid, start small, do one thing well, break things down and find your role. So if there's a campaign running and you're a small team, it can even be like, okay, we don't have a capacity to run this campaign right now, but what we can do is we can get some press around it. We can do this, or we can, design some stuff for it. So it's, breaking things down and being realistic as a team, but also planning for growth, planning that this is what we're going to do now, and that's going to, like, we're trying to get to this point where we can do this. And if you don't know what's going on, like, I think this is a great chance, like, keeping an eye on Animal Rebellion's Facebook pages, events pages, following different groups around the world and being like, oh, they're doing that. Maybe we could try something like that. And there's also, there's talks, introduction talks, campaigns and trainings on our website. And it's great to act, but I think, you know, we want to make sure we're moving in the same direction while innovating at the same time. The final thing before a little tiny bit more on goals is, yeah, growing as a team. I think social time is really important. Understanding each other's strengths. Like, you might have people in your team who, you know, have these amazing skills, who have this amazing like work experience or life experience. And when you kind of get to know each other as people, you can start to tap into that. I think peer-to-peer mentoring is really great. And that's basically where you like buddy up with someone else in your team and you just have check-ins and talk about what's going on for you, how you're managing things. It's a really great way of just growing and also like embedding like a regenerative culture as well, and skill sharing. And yeah, process and structure, I know really enables like the freedom of a group, because if you all know that everyone's working along the same lines and thinking along the same lines and shares this purpose, then you can split off into working groups. And it's not the, you know, it doesn't feel like as much like there's just one person who has to hold everything together, because everyone's on the same page. And yeah, referring back to the pyramid and remembering everyone is as well. And I think it's a nice image. It's an image that I would like to be real, and I think it will be, of like everyone, people around the world, and everyone's just, you know, looking at this pyramid and being like, what's next? And, you know, we're talking to each other and we're building together to this kind of movement, which is what we are. So I think, yeah, like setting milestones and using SMART goals is fantastic. Something I used to hate, but now adore. They're very good. So yeah, specific, measurable, attainable. And I think that one's so critical. It's great to set goals that are aspirational, but we also have to feel that we can achieve them. And relevant, they align with our mission, our strategy. And time bound, setting things with time limits, being like, in 3 months we want to do this, and then assessing and then planning on from that. So I'll end with this slide on tips and tricks, which is every meeting ending with action points that allow you to move at least one step forward. Stay small and split, which I've already talked about. Yeah, 6 to 8 is a really great group size. And this might, it depends on the group as well. So for example, for something like, you know, a big whole group discussion space, you're probably going to have more than that. But for actual like getting things done in a meeting, 6 to 8 is a really good size. Engaging with your community, I think, is a fantastic one. You know, being relevant, being engaged, especially for local groups. Not being afraid to innovate. So yeah, trying new things. That's who we are as Animal Rebellion. We split off from Extinction Rebellion, which was quite, you know, a brave thing to do, in that Extinction Rebellion was the big one with all the media, and we split off and tried something new. So I think, you know, let's keep innovating as an organization, as a movement. Our messaging is our strength, staying consistent. And yeah, we are one organization around the world. We have this same mission, and we have the same message, and we have this same goal, and we really we are, I think, one group, and we'll learn and we'll grow from each other. And yeah, I think the final thing I want to say before we kind of just open it up is that, you know, if you're here, you are a leader and you can empower people. And it can sometimes seem or feel like, you know, intimidating and overwhelming, of like, I don't know what I'm doing or who am I to kind of lead someone or tell them or bring them in. But, you know, we're all leaders, and we all have that capacity to show other people how they can be leaders. And I think that's something that Animal Rebellion does. And it's our goal to have everyone feeling like they can make a choice about their future. And I think that's where I will leave it. So thank you so much. I'll stop sharing now and stop recording. And